Today is the second in our series of bumper sticker theology, and today's theme is love the sinner, hate the sin. The scripture reading today is from Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5, and it's part of what's known as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, if you were here earlier this spring, you might remember as we made our way through the Gospel of Matthew that we spent a good 3 weeks just on this sermon because it is a very long sermon. And it contains a large part of Jesus' teachings, including so many of them that have become part of our common cultural heritage. The Beatitudes are in here, the Golden Rule, the Lord's Prayer, so many more. And at the very end of this 3-chapter long sermon, Matthew writes this: "Now when Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." So, as I read this, think about what might be astounding about these words and what it means that Jesus spoke as one with authority. And listen for what God is saying to you today. This is Matthew 7, verses 1 through 5. "Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Will the children come forward?
Praise.
few weeks ago, I joined some friends at Lazy Oaks Beer Garden over here off Long Point, and it was trivia night. So we were going to play some trivia, and one of my clergy friends, Scott Harbison, was part of the group too. And it turned out one of the questions was, name 7 of the sins that define Dante's 9 circles of hell in the Inferno. So Scott and I are like, we got it. We're clergy, we know all about sins. We've got them down. And so we go off naming sins: lust, sloth, gluttony, pride, envy. We had this all figured out. Want to know about sins? We got it. We're the pastors. And as it turns out, only a few of those were actually in Dante's Inferno. He had a completely different list of sins, including things like anger and fraud and treachery. We didn't know all the sins after all. We still won, but we didn't win based on that one. Someone told me not long ago that they wanted to hear more about sin in our worship services, which I thought was interesting. This person wanted to have specific sins spelled out so that they could learn to avoid them and get rid of them in their own lives and get better at living a holy life. And there is nothing wrong with that impulse. We want to live lives close to God. We want to be upright people. We want to be able to say that we have conquered sins in our lives. We might say this is the whole point of church, right? We want to grow in our relationships with God and each other, and growing in the image of God is part of that. So when we say, love the sinner, hate the sin, it doesn't sound like a bad approach. We would never want to hate sinners. After all, Jesus tells us to love even our enemies, so surely we would love all the sinners and just hate what they do. We don't want anyone to live in sin, so we should hate that sin that lives within them. We should hate the thing they're doing that goes against God's commands. But the issue with this, as with some of the other bumper sticker themes that we're looking at, is that love the sinner, hate the sin isn't in Scripture. We may even think this is something Jesus himself said, maybe in that long Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus never said this, and it's not anywhere else in Scripture either. It's not a bad statement in and of itself, but in practice, it's a difficult thing. The difficulty about it is that it's hard to hate another person's sin without hurting the one who's committing that sin. And when we use this phrase, we're almost certainly not talking about a particular sin that we see in ourselves. We're probably talking about a sin that we've somehow avoided. Most often these days, we hear this phrase associated with the LGBT community. We say, I love the sinner, but I hate their sexual orientation because it's sinful. I love that sinner, but I hate their gender identity. That's a sin. And this is a hurtful, unbiblical way to deal with our differences. We all sin, of course. Even the Apostle Paul talked about his own sin. He said, the thing I want to do, I can't do. The thing I don't want to do is what I end up doing. All of us can relate to that. I don't want to be a glutton, but then I sit down and eat the whole sleeve of Thin Mints. I know y'all have been there. Or the whole pint of ice cream. Did you see the other day was National Donut Day? Did y'all know that? They're giving away free. We want to do it. We want to be upright. We don't want to sin, but we do things that aren't good for us. And Jesus wants us to take sin seriously, both personal sin and corporate sin. He does talk about the amount of sin in the world and how harmful it is. When the woman caught in adultery is about to get stoned to death, Jesus tells the accusers, you who have not sinned may cast the first stone. And they all walk away because they know they've done it. And then he tells her, go and sin no more. Sin matters. And frankly, some sins are worse than others. Killing someone in cold blood is worse than killing someone in self-defense. Cheating on a spouse is worse than cheating in a Monopoly game. Not all sins are created equal. But one thing we do know about Jesus is that he loved all the sinners, and he loves all of us. What Jesus tells us to do, though, is not love the sinner. Jesus tells us, love your neighbor. You hear the difference? Love the sinner. Love your neighbor. And he makes clear that our neighbors include everyone, near and far. When we say love the sinner, we're focusing on what exactly? Their sin. We're identifying them, we're defining them by their sin, rather than defining them as one who is created in the image of God. That's what a neighbor is. One who is created in the image of God. And when you look at someone and think of them as a neighbor, you're going to focus on their God-created self, on their beauty, on their potential, on their important place in the universe, and not on their sinfulness. When love the sinner becomes our slogan, we end up putting ourselves in a higher place than them. We might not even know we're doing it, but we're not thinking of that person as equal to us. We're becoming judgmental. We're saying, you are a sinner, and I am graciously choosing to love you anyway. How does that sound? A little prideful? A little arrogant? A little like that scripture that Robin read? In that story, a fine upstanding citizen goes to the temple and prays a prayer of thanksgiving that he's not like all the bad people, including that guy over there. He tells God how well he's doing, and meanwhile, the other man, who is a despised outsider, bows deeply to God and prays for mercy. The fine upstanding citizen sees this outsider as a sinner, not as a neighbor. And so the love that he might have had turns to judgment. Love the sinner, and thank God I'm not like them. In the story, Jesus makes it obvious how this just doesn't fly. In the second reading, Jesus is even more direct. Quit judging your neighbor. And notice the language that Jesus uses for that other person. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? How can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. Not the sinner's eye, your neighbor's eye. Before you even consider your neighbor, this other person created in the image of God, look at your own self. The bigger problem is there. So I think we need a new bumper sticker or a new slogan. Instead of love the sinner, hate the sin, we could say, love your neighbor even though you are a sinner. Love your neighbor because your neighbor needs love. Love your neighbor because God first loved you. Love your neighbor because love will change the world. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.